to today's webinar, Fire Prevention and EAP Planning, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're very happy you can join us today. My name is Michelle Wilcox, and I will be your moderator today. I will also be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. We do not control the audio, your devices do. So if you have audio difficulties, try adjusting the volume settings on your device. If a telephone line goes down during the call, we'll hang up and call back again at the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear. Then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, and we will be working your questions. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the session today. And if we run completely out of time, we will be online afterwards to follow up. If we run completely out of time, we will go ahead and respond afterwards, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@AspenRMG for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of upcoming webinars covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. With that, let's begin today's webinar. Our presenter today is Joel Sherman. Joel Sherman has more than 47 years experience in the safety and workers' compensation field. He recently retired from his position as the Vice President of Safety and Corporate Affairs for Grimway Farms, a vegetable grower, packer, shipper based in Kern County, California. During his 22-year tenure with Grimway, Mr. Sherman oversaw 6 departments responsible for health, safety, environmental, and workers' compensation issues for more than 7,500 employees and contract laborers. Other duties include assisting the company with meeting regulatory compliance requirements at 18 locations in 7 states, leading the corporate crisis response team, addressing corporate security issues, and acting as corporate spokesperson. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to Joel. And I want to thank everybody for being here this morning, and you can bear with us for a few minutes. We will get the presentation up and running.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me?
We can. You're not in presentation mode though, Joel, so if you want to.
Yeah, can you see my screen though? That's the question.
Yes.
Good, okay. How's that look?
That looks perfect, thank you.
All right, well then we can stop panicking about technology killing us all off, all right? And I want to thank you for that introduction, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that we have some time to get through everything today. We're going to talk about fire prevention plans and emergency action plans, and what those 2 programs are, and the fact that they are, in fact, 2 separate programs. Because what we often see when we're out in the field looking at an operation or doing a risk survey, and we ask for the fire prevention plan, what I typically see is that somebody brings me the emergency action plan and says, here you go. Well, that's part of the plan that we're looking for, but there really are 2 separate plans, and if you have more than 10 employees at your company, you've got to have both plans. So we're going to talk about what each plan entails and exactly what it takes to put one together, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. All right, let me see if I can move the slide. Just a real quick content disclaimer here. The information that's presented is going to be general in nature, and it's really intended to present an overview of employment practices. The written and verbal contents of the presentation are not intended to constitute a consulting or advice relationship. There's no real client relationship here between me and you guys, the attendees. So just want to go through that disclaimer real quickly so that everybody understands that this is really just an overview. Our agenda today, we're going to do an introduction. We're going to have a little history about fire prevention plans and emergency action plans and how they came about. And we're going to discuss fire prevention plans in detail so that you have some idea of what's necessary when you put one together. Same thing with emergency action plans. We'll discuss that. And then we'll have hopefully some time at the end for questions. I want you guys to actually take a look at this slide, this picture that's on this slide. I took this photograph. This was an explosion at a main gas line running through a farmer's field just south of Bakersfield, California, a few years back. And what happened was they were ripping an almond orchard, and they were doing what's known as a deep rip with a Caterpillar tractor. And that deep rip actually hit one of the main gas lines traveling between the fields in Bakersfield down to the Los Angeles area. So it was a huge gas line that they punctured. And it sparked, caused an explosion, killed the driver of the Caterpillar tractor. I was probably 7 or 8 miles away. I wasn't actually at this facility. I was coming from another facility heading back into town when this went off. I was in the truck. We were driving. It actually shook the truck. And as I got closer to the explosion, it began to pelt my vehicle with rocks and debris and so forth that was blowing out of that. If you look at that slide, you look at the bottom line there, those are full-grown almond trees in an orchard. They're about 40 to 50 feet tall. And those plumes of flame coming out are about 600 to 700 feet tall. And it was absolutely amazing. And it really was something that showed the awesome power of fire if the right conditions exist. There was a farmhouse about half a mile from where this took place, and it flattened the farmhouse. Luckily, nobody was inside. So it's just one of those things that kind of gives you a grasp of how dangerous fire can be. In the presentation, we're going to discuss the purpose of a fire prevention program, the purpose of an emergency action plan, the legal codes pertaining to each, employer responsibilities for each of them. So what are your responsibilities as an employer when you set these plans up? And then lastly, what are the required components for each? And we're going to treat them separately, not as the same type of a program. And then at the end, there'll be some additional resources that you can go to if you need to build your own plan. I always like to start fire discussions out with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I'm sure anybody who's been in safety for any length of time knows about this. But it was one of the driving causes for safety in the workplace as we know it today, also workers' compensation as we know it today, and it was basically a fire that got out of control and killed 148 people. It started on March 25th, 1911. It was likely started on the 8th floor of the Ash building by a discarded cigarette. The reason why the discarded cigarette caused such a conflagration was because the fire was fed by the large amounts of cotton and paper waste that were there on the 8th floor where they were manufacturing these shirtwaists. And so you had a lot of cotton fiber, you had a lot of paper products. Once that fire started, it burned out of control quickly. It burned for approximately 18 minutes, and workers were trapped by locked exit doors because they wanted to control, theft and other things that were taking place. So they actually locked the exit doors, and the one door that actually was open, they overloaded the fire escape, and it collapsed. And when it was all over and done with, there were 148 people who died as a result of this. 146 people who died as a result of this. 129 women and 17 men. And the pictures of the dead bodies on the New York street, they went nationwide. And really, one of the most ironic situations that could have possibly happened is at the time this fire was taking place, in Albany, New York, the New York State Supreme Court was striking down New York's new workers' compensation law. So you had all these people killed in an industrial injury, and you had the workers' compensation law that had been crafted a few years before being struck down by the Supreme Court. Anyway, those pictures went nationwide, and it started a movement which really changed safety as we know it and changed the workers' compensation industry as we know it. So what's the purpose of a fire prevention plan? Well, the purpose of the plan is to eliminate the causes of fire at the workplace. If you want to separate fire prevention plans from emergency action plans, the separation is that fire prevention is for exactly that. You're going to have your steps and your procedures to prevent a fire from occurring at the workplace. Whereas the emergency action plan assumes that some emergency has occurred, and it could be a fire, could be electrical issues. It could be any numbers of things. It could be a tornado, it could be an earthquake, but an emergency has occurred. And what are you going to do to get your people safely away from that emergency? So that's the difference between the two plans. And the fire prevention plan is supposed to prevent the loss of life and property due to fire. And it's also necessary to comply with safety and health regulations regarding fire prevention. So you have to have basically both plans. The scope of the problem: how big is fire as an issue in industry and in the workplace? Well, statistics from the U.S. Fire Administration from 2023, they're hard to dissect because you don't really get something that says it's specifically workplace related. But they do have a category for non-residential fires. There were 110,000 of those in 2023. There were 1,200 injuries, 130 fatalities, and $3.2 billion in property losses. And a significant portion of that were fires that occurred on the workplace and at the workplace. So it's a big problem. We're going to have some polling questions here. So here's our first polling question that we're going to deal with. And the question is simple. It's, what is the purpose of a fire prevention plan?
Thanks, Joel. Sorry about that. I'll go ahead and I'll read the answers. Eliminate the causes of fire in the workplace. B, prevent the loss of life and property due to fire. I'm sorry. C, comply with safety and health regulations, or D, all of the above. And I'm going to give everybody a couple seconds here to go ahead and respond. And we want to thank everybody for your participation. It means a lot. And I like to wait until at least there's about 60% votes, and it looks like I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. So the corresponding answers are 90% or all of the above. Let me share that with you. And then we've got 9% prevent the loss of life and property due to fire, 7% eliminate the causes of fire in the workplace, and 3% comply with safety and health regulations.
And the actual answer is all of the above. Can I move on now, Michelle?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the applicable regulations associated with fire prevention plans and emergency action plans. So what we can draw from this is these things are so important that there actually are specific codes and regulations out there that address the two plans, what needs to be in it, what your responsibilities are. 191039 of the federal regulations is the fire prevention plan, and 1910.38 is the emergency action plan. So if you go to those sections, you get more information. And then interestingly enough, there's three other plan notations or regulations that are associated with it, .35, .36, and .37, which are all related to exits and evacuations and regulations about keeping your exits open. So it tells you that it's not just preventing the fire, but it's also if a fire occurs or if some kind of an emergency occurs, how are you going to get people out of the building? All right. On a fire prevention plan, the employer requirements, well, number one, you got to have a written fire prevention plan if you have more than 10 employees. Now, the 10 employees breakpoint is kind of interesting. My own personal recommendation is, even if you only have 5 or 6 employees, have a written plan. That way you're going to eliminate confusion among anybody who works for you or anything that's going on in terms of at the workplace. If you just have it sort of word of mouth, then when an actual emergency occurs, there's no place where somebody can go back and refer to and figure out, oh, I got to do this or that or something else. Plus, if there is ever a question as to whether or not you have a plan, having a written plan eliminates that question. You need to keep a copy of the plan in the workplace, and you need to make the plan available to the employees so that they can review it. So those are the basic requirements. Now, what are the required elements? Okay, you've got to have a written plan, but what has to be in that written plan? Well, the first thing is pretty simple, at least in terms of what you're being asked to do. You're being asked to list all of the major fire hazards in the workplace. Okay, so you have to go through, if at your workplace do you have large volumes of gasoline, or you have large volumes of waste paper, or you have large volumes of cotton fabric or something like that, those constitute a major fire hazard. So you have to have a listing of those major fire hazards. In addition to that, you have to have handling and storing procedures for each one of those major fire hazards. And you have to look further and determine what are the potential ignition sources for that particular fire hazard. So you have to list what those potential sources of ignition are. And then lastly, if you have fire protection in place to control the hazard, what is the fire protection for each hazard? You also need to have procedures to control accumulation of flammable and combustible waste materials. If we go back to the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire, that's what caused the fire. They had a massive accumulation of this waste product that they hadn't cleared out and hadn't taken care of, and then the cigarette got into it and the fire was off and running. You have to have procedures for regular maintenance of safeguards installed. So if you have safeguards installed on heat producing equipment or ignition sources, those things have to be maintained. You can't just put them in and forget it. And how are you going to maintain those? You need the names or job titles of the people who are responsible for maintaining the fire control systems and equipment and controlling that accumulation of waste material or flammable or combustible materials, both on a raw material side and on a waste material side. And then lastly, you have to have an employee training program so that the employees are trained on the potential hazards and what they're supposed to do. When we talk about fire, we always talk about the fire triangle, because this is important when you're looking at how you're going to be putting your fire prevention plan together. In order to control a fire, you got to control one of these three elements. You got to control either the oxygen to the fire, the fuel to the fire, or the ignition source. And if you look at that a little more closely, you're really going to be hard pressed to control the oxygen unless you're working in some kind of a vacuum. So the only two elements that most people can control in the fire triangle are the fuel source and the ignition source. So you focus your attention on those two areas when you put your plan together. Potential fire hazards, looking at those types of situations, well, electrical hazards. Electricity is basically fire waiting to happen, okay? Flammable and combustible materials, that's the fuel that's going to make your fire grow, all right? Portable heaters. Now, portable heaters are actually mentioned specifically in the regulation. And the reason for that is they cause a lot of fires. So if you've got portable heaters, you got people who are putting little heating elements underneath their desk or whatever they're doing with them, those portable heaters are a potential source of ignition and they need to be controlled. Cutting, welding, open flame operations, these are actually so significant that you typically have two different layers of regulation here. You've got the fire prevention plan, but you'll also have a hot work permit plan. And both of those are designed to control the potential fires that occur when they're cutting, welding, or doing open flame operations, all right? Office hazards. You need to control hazards in the workplace and even in the office itself. Even though you might look at it and say, well, compared to the shop floor, the office is pretty simple. Yes, but still, you need to correct that because we do have fires that occur in office locations. Now, maybe they're caused by the portable heater that somebody left on underneath their desk, or it could be just the fact that there are so many new electrical gadgets that we're using in offices that we're overloading our circuit systems. And then lastly is smoking. Smoking is not as big a deal as it used to be. There just, quite frankly, aren't as many people who smoke. But smoking still leads to fires, so smoking should be controlled, and it should be listed as one of your potential hazards. Polling question number 2.
All right, here we go. So which of the following statements is true? A, no one died in the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire. B, portable space heaters can be a potential fire hazard. C, fire prevention plans must always be in writing. Or D, earth, wind, and fire are parts of the fire triangle. I'm having trouble speaking today. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to give it a few minutes here, and then before we close the poll, and it looks like we've got, let me wait just a couple more seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and close it now. It looks like 74% say portable space heaters can be a potential fire hazard. 22% fire prevention plans must always be in writing, or 3% earth, wind, and fire are parts of the fire triangle.
I'm sorry about that last one. I have a weird sense of humor. But the correct answer is portable space heaters can be a potential fire hazard. C, the fire prevention plans must always be in writing. Well, they don't have to be in writing if you have 10 or fewer employees. I recommend they be in writing for that, but it's not really a regulation. All right, shall we move on?
Yep.
Okay, electrical hazards. So now we're going to go through these individual hazards and kind of talk about it. Electrical hazards are the leading cause of workplace fires. And if you think about it, it makes sense because almost every work site has electricity going to it. It is a power source. And so your written program should address electrical issues as a potential fire hazard. And when you are putting it together, remember you got to put some kind of control measures in place as well. So it's just a brief listing of control measures that you might consider when you're putting a plan together. You might consider adding something about replacing worn or frayed wiring, of using only appropriately rated fuses, of extension cords not used in place of permanent wiring, because extension cords can be damaged. They can also, depending on where you put them, the very presence of the extension cord can be an issue. I did a walkthrough at an operation a couple years ago, and they had an outside kiosk set up in a driveway where, as the customers were leaving, that's where they paid to talk to them. That kiosk needed electricity, and what they done was put like a 300-foot extension cord out there. Now the kiosk was 5 years old. That extension cord had been there for 5 years. No one was thinking about putting permanent wiring in, but the worst part about it was the extension cord was running through a metal door frame and a metal door. And every time that metal door closed, it impacted the insulation on that wiring. And at some point, if it cuts through that wiring, you'll have an electrified door, and it'll be a problem for the employees. So extension cords are not supposed to be used as permanent wiring. When you're looking at extension cords, use only UL or FM approved extension cords. Periodically check wiring and electrical equipment, especially in locations where the fire risk is high. Make sure that they're in safe condition, properly operating, etc. And then ensure that grounding and spacing is in place when you're performing maintenance on equipment. These are just some items that you can include in your plan. All right, here now we're at portable heaters. Well, if you look at the numbers, it's an estimated 1,700 fires a year are caused by portable space heaters. And if they're used in the workplace, they should be listed as a potential hazard in the fire prevention plan, along with the appropriate controls. All portable heaters shall be approved by a responsible person. Portable heaters should have safety features like tip-over protection or sensors that automatically shut it off after a period of time or when it tips over or overheats. They need to be maintained and have adequate clearance between the heater and combustible furnishings or other materials at all times. Another time I was out walking in a facility, they have a little warehouse area. The warehouse workers had set up their own little break area there, and they had some like lawn chairs, and they had a space heater where the space heater was running so it would keep them warm when they were there drinking their coffee or whatever. The problem was that they also had like 3 5-gallon gas cans within about 18 inches of the space heater. There was nobody there when I made the walkthrough, but the space heater was on. So you've got a real potential for fire there with a portable space heater. So you need to make sure that they're not in close proximity to flammable or combustible materials and that they're not left unattended when in use. Flammables and combustibles. All right, so now we're talking about the fuel associated with fires. They're substances that can ignite at either relatively low temperatures or they may pose a risk of catastrophic explosion if ignited, and so they require special care and handling. Your FPP should contain a listing of all flammables and combustibles at the workplace. And the list must include both Class A and Class B combustibles and procedures for safe storage and handling for both of them. And the list really should be evaluated on a regular basis and updated, so you need to mention a responsible person who's going to take care of that inventory. Class A combustibles, what are they? Well, these are common materials like wood, paper, cloth, rubber, plastics, etc. that can act as a fuel and are found in non-specialized areas. I mean, you might even see them in offices and so forth. So if you've got some area where a lot of this material collects, maybe on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, your program should include some sort of procedures to make sure that this material gets cleaned up on a regular basis and doesn't keep increasing the potential for fire.
All right. Let's go with polling question number 3. Which of the following is the leading cause of fires? A, smoking, B, improperly stored gasoline, C, electrical hazards, or D, arson? And while we're waiting for the polls, Jill, somebody wanted clarification on the PPP plan or the fire prevention plan. Is it if they have over 10 employees in the company or a specific office?
Generally speaking, it depends on how you're going to break your company down. Some companies can consider like an independent office to be sort of a separate section, and it's away from the rest of their operations and so forth. And they could theoretically make the argument that, well, we have fewer than 10 employees, so we don't have to have a fire prevention plan. But if you were to get in an issue or a situation where somebody was questioning that, it would be just as easy for somebody to say, wait a minute, you got 300 employees in the company and they're scattered all over the place. Why don't you just have one sort of basic plan that applies to everyone? My recommendation would be that you look at the totality of your organization and set a plan up based on the totality of the organization. And depending on how sophisticated your organization is, that plan could be online and accessible to the employees as long as they know where it is. So it's kind of a weird way to answer the question, but I always opt for more documentation rather than less.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I am going to go ahead and share the poll. Let's see here. We've got 96% say electrical hazard and 4% say smoking.
And it's electrical hazard.
Great. Go ahead and I'll let you have the end.
Class A, safe handling. So we've got these materials that are combustible. They're around our facility. How are we going to take care of them? Well, these are some suggestions you can put into your plan. Dispose of waste daily or keep trash in metal-lined receptacles with tight-fitting covers, okay? Keep the work area clean and free of what's known as a fuel path. The fuel path is basically, you've got some materials there, they're combustible, and they spread across the floor, but at the other end, where the pile ends, there's some highly flammable materials there. So you could have the fire start in this less flammable area, follow the fuel path, and then hit something bigger. So you want to make sure that you clear those fuel paths so you're not allowing the fire to spread. Keep combustibles away from potential ignition sources, hot plates, soldering iron, like that, heating element that those guys had set up in their little break room. Store paper stock. If you have lots of paper stock, store it in metal cabinets. Store rags in metal bins with self-closing lids. Don't order excessive amounts of combustibles around. Sometimes you get a big deal on some sort of product, so you order a ton of it, and then you got it sitting in there and it's potentially causing a fire hazard, all right? And then make frequent inspections to anticipate the fires before they start. Class B combustibles. All right, now this is what we tend to think of when we're thinking of combustibles or flammable materials. It's Class Bs, where this is where you find your gasolines, your oils, your greases, your tars, oil-based paint, lacquers, flammable gases, flammable aerosols. So we kind of automatically know these are dangerous. And in many respects, we are more careful with these kinds of materials than we are with the just Class A combustible materials. But you got to remember, we got to take care and we have to protect against these things getting too hot, getting a source of ignition, because they will explode. So when you're putting your plan together, if you have a lot of Class B materials around, you got to have safe handling procedures in them. And there's a lot of stuff that you can talk about, using only approved pumps when you're taking suction from the top of a tank, or dispensing from tanks, drums, barrels, or something like that, or making sure that you're using approved self-closing valves or faucets. When you put them into a container, make sure that the nozzle and the container are electrically interconnected by contact or a bonding wire, and that either the tank or the container is grounded. You don't want to store and handle and use the Class B combustibles only in approved locations. And you want to make sure that the vapors are prevented from reaching ignition sources. Additionally, don't use flammable liquids as cleaning agents. I walked a place one time where they had been using some highly flammable material as a cleaning agent, and somebody lit a cigarette and it caused a problem. Don't use, handle, or store Class B combustibles near exits, stairs, or any other area that's supposed to be an exit. You want to keep your exits clear. No welding, grinding, cutting, or using unsafe electrical appliances near the Class B combustibles. If you got to do some work there, move those combustibles out or whatever. Don't allow heat or open flame or smoke near the Class B combustibles. and then know the location of and how to use the nearest portable fire extinguisher for Class B fires. Polling question number 4.
All right, why shouldn't Class A combustibles, paper, cardboard, rags, etc., be stored in electrical rooms? A, electrical components are a potential ignition source. B, it makes it safety department mad. C, your supervisor will nag you about it. Or D, Class A combustibles are messy and can smell bad. And it looks like majority says 100% electrical components are a potential ignition source.
All right. Cutting, welding, and open flame. If you're doing that, the thing about cutting, welding, and open flames is basically you're probably in a hot work permit situation. And hot work permits are covered by 1910-252, 1926-352, which is the first one is general industry safety orders, and the second one is specifically construction safety orders. Cutting and welding should be done by an authorized personnel in a designated area whenever it's possible. Ensure adequate ventilation. So you got to have plenty of ventilation when it's taking place. You want to make sure that your torches, regulators, the equipment that you're using, they're UL listed or FM approved, that the affected personnel are wearing the appropriate eye protection and the appropriate protective clothing, and that you don't do any welding or cutting in sprinkler areas when the sprinklers are out of service. So if you got a sprinkler area and you're going to do some welding or cutting in there, you need to make sure that the sprinklers are still functioning and still in service. Additional considerations for welding and open flame should be prohibited in confined spaces if there's a potential for explosive atmospheres, gases, vapors, and so forth. Cutting or welding prohibited on metal walls, ceilings, or roofs built of combustible sandwich type panel or having a combustible covering. This was one of the fires I actually investigated for the company I worked for in one of their cold storage facilities. They had some work done on one of the insulated walls, and about 6 or 8 hours later, it smoldered into a fire and it burned a building down. So it's the kind of thing that you do need to be aware of and you need to watch out for. Test confined spaces to ensure atmosphere does not exceed 10% of the lower flammable limit before the work begins. Make sure if you're working on tanks that they've been cleaned and purged, and then you will need a fire watch. You need somebody there, and that fire watch may actually have to stay there when the work is even completed, just to make sure that there's no residual. I mean, if we had a fire watch that stayed there in that one building that burnt down, we probably wouldn't have lost the building. Office hazards, well, they exist in office settings. Fire in offices that are more common, mainly because of the increased use of electrical equipment. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times you walk through an office and you see a surge protector plugged into a single outlet with like 15 other things plugged into that surge protector. So you need to avoid overloading circuits with office equipment. You need to make sure that you're turning off non-essential equipment at the end of the workday. Keeping storage areas clear of trash and combustibles. Avoiding placement of extension cords under carpets where they can't be seen if they're damaged or where they can, heat up. And ensure that trash and paper set aside for recycling are not allowed to accumulate until they become actually a combustible hazard. Smoking at the workplace is not as common as it used to be, but it still can be a potential hazard. So you need to only allow smoking outside and in designated smoking areas which are positioned away from flammables and combustibles. Smokers must put their cigarettes out completely and then dispose of the butts in a designated receptacle. And then you have people who are using e-cigarettes, and there are some issues with e-cigarettes as well. You need to make sure that the e-cigarette itself is stored in an appropriate case and kept away from heat or metal objects, because you could have issues with the batteries or with the fuel. Do not charge e-cigarettes with a phone or a tablet charger. You need to charge them with the charger that came with the e-cigarette. And then if your batteries in that e-cigarette become wet or damaged, they need to be replaced because they can heat up and that can lead to a fire. Lastly on this, training. All employees should receive fire prevention training at the time of hire and annually thereafter, or whatever the work changes in the work process requires additional training. And that statement pretty much applies to any safety program you have in place at the workplace. You always have to train them at the time of hire, annually thereafter, and then whenever changes in the process occur. Training should include a review of the appropriate codes. So whatever code applies at your workplace, they should review that. A review of the written plan, good housekeeping practices for fire prevention, fire response and notification. How are we going to notify somebody if there's a fire? Fire extinguisher usage, but that's only if you require them to use fire extinguishers. If you say, don't worry about the fire extinguishers, you don't need to use them, run away, you don't have to train them for those, okay? And then fire hazard recognition, they need to be able to recognize the fire hazard when they see one. Following question number 5.
Yeah, okay, here we go. So which of the following statements about fire prevention training is true? A, it is only required at the time of hire. B, both A and D. C, it must include a review of the written plan. Or D, it isn't required because it is just common sense. I'll give it a second here. I know we're quick on time, so let's go with, let me close the poll. I'll give it a couple seconds here. Okay, looks like the majority has said that it must include a review of the written plan. 28% says both A and D. 4% says it is only required at the time of hire.
The correct answer is C, it must include a review of the written plan. And we shall move on. Housekeeping practices, I mean, these are fairly basic and they apply not just to fire, but just keeping your workplace in good shape. So minimize combustible material storage, keep doors, hallways, stairs, and exit routes clear, properly dispose of combustible waste in designated containers, use and store flammable materials in well-ventilated areas away from ignition sources, use only non-flammable cleaning products, store incompatible substances away from each other, and limit hot work to controlled and well-ventilated areas. These are just things you can include in your plan as part of your training program. Inspecting equipment and appliances to make sure they're in good working order, using only properly safeguarded portable heating units, reporting gas leaks immediately, repair leaks and clean up flammable liquid spills immediately, keep the work areas free of scrap, dust, lint, sawdust. These are basic things that you can do to prevent fires in the workplace. Don't use extension cords as permanent wiring, avoid overloading circuits, ensure that hot work permits are obtained if necessary, and turn off electrical equipment when not in use. Now, we shift from the fire prevention plan to the emergency action plan. Well, the emergency action plan assumes something bad has happened, and now you got to deal with how are you going to get your employees out of the workplace, okay? It's the difference between the two plans. Fire prevention is exactly that. We're going to prevent fires from happening. Emergency action, when emergencies occur, which may include a fire, this is how we're going to respond. An emergency action plan is basically a structured document. It's written and it outlines the specific steps that need to be taken at the workplace in order to respond effectively to an emergency. Primary goal is to protect lives, safeguard property, and ensure a safe and organized response to minimize the harm and disruption that the emergency causes. The emergency action plan must be in writing, kept in the workplace, available for employees for review, and employers with 10 or fewer employees may communicate the plan orally. So you're back to that 10 or fewer people, but I would strongly recommend that you have an emergency action plan in place. What are the potential emergencies? Well, fire, we talked about that, but there are also natural disasters that may occur in your geographic location, such as tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes. If you're in an area that is subject to these, you should have them mentioned in your emergency plan and how you're going to respond. You might have medical emergencies. Somebody has a heart attack or something like that. You can incorporate that into your plan, how you're going to respond. Active shooter. This is becoming more and more common. More and more workplaces have active shooter plans in place, but they also need to include it in their emergency action plan. Power failures. If you've got hospital or medical or care facilities, rehabilitation, a power failure can be catastrophic. So you need to have some sort of plan in place. What are you going to do if there's a power failure? And then civil unrest. You have riots or something like that. How are you going to respond? The required elements. Well, the emergency action plan must have at a minimum. What are the reporting procedures for fires or other emergencies? What are your emergency evacuation procedures? How are you going to get people out of the building? What procedures are you going to have for employees that have to stay behind to shut down critical equipment and can't leave immediately? And how are they going to be able to recognize when it's time for them to leave? What's the method you're going to have to account for all employees after evacuation? What are the procedures you're going to use if you need to do medical with the names and job titles of those employees who can provide additional information to the employees affected by the plan. All right? What's a description and explanation of the employee alarm system? How are you going to alert employees to the emergency? And then, of course, a description of the employee training plan, because everybody will have to be trained on it. Polling question number 6.
All right. So which of the following statements best describes the difference between FPPs and EAPs? A, they are the same, just have different names. B, they are required by different regulatory agencies. C, FPPs prevent fires and EAPs are for emergency response. D, only hospitals are required to have an EAP. And going to give it a couple seconds here. And it looks like majority of the polling says that they are FPPs prevent fires, EAPs are for emergency responses.
Well, that's good, because that's the one thing I wanted everybody to walk away from this training with, understanding that they're 2 different programs for 2 different reasons. So perfect. All right. Now, looking at your emergency action plan, one of the things you have to have in there is reporting procedures. So how will emergencies be reported? You're going to require your employees to call 911, or do you have some sort of an internal notification system where they're going to call security, or they're going to call this number, or whatever? But the employees need to be told what it is they're supposed to do in the event of an emergency. Then you have to have an employee notification system. You've got an emergency. How are you going to notify the employees that you have an emergency? What's the audible alarm? What's the intercom system, or is there one? You're going to use the public address system. Downstream notifications. I always include this because sometimes certain emergencies require you to notify 5 or 6 emergency responders of different types. For instance, when I worked for the farms, we had 14 facilities that had refrigeration capability. A couple of those facilities had massive amounts of anhydrous ammonia, over 100,000 pounds. If we had a leak on the anhydrous ammonia system, I not only had to notify 911 and say, I got a problem here, I had to notify the hazard response team of 911. I had to notify the state team regarding this plan. There was about 5 or 6 different people that had to be notified. So I needed that set up so that if somebody had an ammonia leak, they could respond accordingly. So you need to know what those regulatory agencies are. And then you should have posted instructions out there about how they're going to report. Evacuation procedures. Well, what you need to explain to the employees what the evacuation conditions are for particular types of emergencies. Are they going to evacuate outside the building to an assembly area, or are they going to shelter in place because of the nature of the emergency? You also need to have a chain of command. Who's going to be in charge when an emergency occurs, and who's going to direct and control it? You have to have routes and exits. How are we going to get people out of the building or to the shelter in place areas? And in high-rise buildings, this is critically important because you won't have people being able to use elevators. What are you going to do if you've got visitors or disabled employees? How are you going to account for them, and how are you going to get them out of the building? You need to have evacuation maps posted prominently in different areas in the building so that somebody can see it and understand what it means. And you should have designated sweepers. Those are the people who are going to be like last out, but they have been given responsibility over a specific area to see if there have been employees that have been left behind or are uncertain what to do. So you have designated sweepers. Real quickly, about shelter in place. Well, when is shelter in place appropriate? For some emergencies, no, you shouldn't do shelter in place. For instance, chemical leaks, very seldom would you want to do a shelter in place. But active threats, somebody with a gun, chemical releases that are isolated to a situation where you can't get people outside, but you have good protection on the inside, you shelter in place there. Severe weather, maybe you need to stay inside during severe weather. Radiological or nuclear events. It's kind of interesting that severe weather thing. I was traveling a few years back. I was in Tornado Alley during high tornado season, stopped at a hotel, a nice hotel, of one of the significant chains that we encounter out there in the field. I got up to my room, turned on the TV, and first thing I saw was tornado warning for my area. So I thought, okay, how am I going to get out of this building? I better go down and talk to the management, see what's the plan if this tornado hits. So I go down, get the man, the guy's front desk, and I say, hey, I see we're in tornado warning right now. What do I do if a tornado comes this way? And the guy looks at me and says, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? He says, well, I'm new here. I've only been here about a week. You've only been here a week? Yeah, I'm not from a tornado area, so I don't have any idea. And they didn't tell you what to do? Nope, didn't tell me anything. So this is an example of this visitor type mentality where I've got somebody who's visiting this facility, they're potentially exposed to an emergency, and management doesn't know how to react in that emergency. So there's obviously a gap in their plan. The emergency action plan should have procedures for determining which method is appropriate in a given situation and notifying all employees which method is going to be used for the present emergency. Critical operations personnel, sometimes there are procedures like, refinery or something like that, where certain equipment has to be shut down sequentially in order to prevent a bigger catastrophe or a bigger problem. So you have to ask yourself, do I have critical operations like that? Have I trained certain employees to stay behind and handle the critical operations before they evacuate? And have those designated employees been trained on how to perform the emergency shutdown procedures, number one. And number two, when to recognize that it's time to abandon the ship and flee. And then the written plan must describe in detail the above procedures and how they're going to be followed by employees. Employee accounting. Okay, we've got everybody out of the building. How do we know it's everybody? So you establish designated assembly areas. Outside, upwind is always recommended. Inside, make sure you got sufficient space to hold everybody. Designate someone to perform a head count, and that designation should occur before the emergency. List anyone who's unaccounted for. Provide the list to the responding authorities. And then establish a procedure to account for non-employees, visitors, customers, etc. And procedures for a further evacuation if the emergency gets larger, all right? And then there's always a question, do we send people back in to look for somebody who's missing? And the answer is no. You wait for the appropriate personnel to arrive from whatever emergency response you get, and they are equipped to go back inside and try and deal with people who got left behind. You don't have people out there in the field that should be going in because they're unprotected. Polling question number 7.
All right. So in which of the following would shelter in place not be the best response to an emergency? A, active threat, B, fire, C, chemical release, or D, severe weather? And it looks like most people were paying attention. Majority of the attendees say 65% say fire.
All right. Moving on.
All right, let's go.
And the correct answer is fire, by the way. Fire, rescue, and medical services. Your emergency planning should include local emergency response assets. You should have the fire department conduct walkthrough of your facility to become familiar with the layout, potential hazards. You should establish a relationship with the local ambulance service. When I was working for the farms, we had a lot of operations that were out in rural areas. Turns out the ambulances were always looking for places where they could park an ambulance in case there was an emergency somewhere in the surrounding area. We always volunteered the parking lots of our facilities so that I would have an ambulance on site if somebody in my facility got injured. So it was kind of a win-win for both of us. I had an ambulance, and then they had the ability to respond to the nearby operations, maybe the grocery store or something else that was close by, but they would have been 20 minutes or 25 minutes away if they were coming from town. So that was the kind of a relationship that we established. And it worked out pretty well. Arrange for the nearby clinic to handle medical emergencies so that they understand what the exposure is. Hey, we've got anhydrous ammonia out here, you might have to deal with it. Hey, we've got pesticides, you might want to prepare for that. And then train on-site personnel in CPR and first aid. Contact people. The EAP must include a list of persons who can answer employee questions regarding the plan and explain any specific duties for which the employee will be responsible. The contact information must include the name, the title, the department, phone number. If you look over here, this fictitious contact list, it's Jenny. She's the safety director. She's in health and safety and environmental, and her phone number is 8675309. I'm sorry, I got a weird sense of humor. EAP review, the last thing that we're going to do with the emergency action plan is review it with each employee who's covered by the plan. You do that when the plan is developed or the employee is assigned or initially to the job, and when the employee's responsibilities under the plan change, and when the plan is changed. And it's also recommended that you review the contents of the emergency action plan at least annually. Polling question number 8, the employee accounting.
Good.
Go ahead.
Okay, the employee accounting procedure in an EAP should include all of the following steps except A, choosing an assembly area upwind of the facility, B, having someone perform a head count, C, a procedure to account for visitors and customers, and D, going back into the facility to find missing persons. And we'll just give it a second here. And again, it looks like everybody's paying attention, so thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. 73% say going back into the facility to find a missing person. 11% say choosing an assembly area upwind of the facility. 9% say having someone perform a head count, and 9% also say a procedure to account for visitors and customers.
All right. Well, the answer is sending people back in. You want to wait for emergency medical personnel, emergency fire, whoever is responding to come and go back in because they will be equipped to deal with what they find inside the building. All right. In summary, number one, I want to apologize for pushing so much information to you in such a short period of time. But we were talking about the 2 plans, and they are in some ways very interconnected. Fires are a significant problem in the workplace, resulting in numerous lost lives and injuries and costing multiple millions in property damage. Fed, OSHA, and various state programs have created specific regulations to help employers control the risk. And so, if you're out in a state that has its own plan, you want to make sure that you check to see if they have specific issues that they want included in their fire prevention plans, because their plan has to meet or exceed the federal plan. And on occasion, you'll run into places where they've decided they want to exceed the federal plan and they've added something that isn't in the federal plan. So if you're in a state for the state plan, make sure you check the state regulations and make sure that you're meeting those requirements as well. The fire prevention plan is designed to prevent fires in the workplace. We talked about that. The emergency action plan details the procedures to be followed in the event of an emergency, including fires. By having both plans, keeping them up to date, and training your employees, you're going to be able to significantly limit the risk of fire in the workplace. And it just occurred to me that one final thing I forgot to talk about was, should you practice evacuation? And yes, you should. Typically, for most workplaces, if they do an annual evacuation, that's sufficient. If you're in the medical industry, such as a hospital or a convalescent home or something like that, you're probably required to do one emergency evacuation for each shift a quarter. And so if you have 3 shifts, you do one, shift number 1 gets done in January, shift number 2 gets done in February, shift number 3 gets done in March, and then for that quarter, you've done all 3 shifts. Based on that, there's some links here. You can go to these links to get information on fire safety, fire prevention plans, emergency action plans, and evacuation procedures. And that e-tool is particularly helpful because it'll actually walk you through all of the elements and ask you questions and help you build your program. Lastly, are there any questions that I can answer at the moment?
All right, so far there was one question. It was, and I'm going to probably murder the spelling, isopropyl alcohol. Is that a Class D chemical? Or Class B flammable?
Alcohol is going to be considered a Class B, yes.
Okay, so Class B. And there are no other questions other than the fact that a lot of people are curious if they can get a copy of the presentation. And as I mentioned before, I will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the okay, so here we got a couple more and we have a few minutes, so if you don't mind, somebody was asking, how does this apply to remote staff working from home? Is the employer responsible for fire prevention?
If they're working from home, not unless you as an employer are providing something that they have to work with at home that's flammable or combustible. When you're working from home, you're still going to be responsible for training them on some basic stuff, and I'm assuming that they come into the office periodically. Maybe they don't come in every day or so forth. So they're going to need to be trained on the fire prevention plan at your office, but I think that you would be hard pressed to find any sort of regulation that requires you to make sure that their home office is sufficient.
All right. And the next question is, what fire prevention is there for employees that are using vehicles, that work out of their vehicles? Is there any?
In other words, like are fire extinguishers required in vehicles and so forth? It would depend on what they're doing and what their vehicles are responsible for. For instance, if you've got a guy who's got a welding truck, he's got oxygen, acetylene, other flammable objects and so forth on his truck, he's going to need to have a fire extinguisher. And most like people who are driving passenger carriers, like minivans and buses and so forth, there'll be fire extinguisher requirements there. So it's going to be, there's no one blanket answer that it covers everything. I mean, if you got an outside salesman who's driving around in basically his personal vehicle, I can't see that a fire prevention plan would be necessary for him. But if he's driving a work truck and that work truck is basically his workspace, and that workspace that he's in, that truck has flammable materials and so forth on it, then yes, you probably would be required to have some sort of a fire prevention plan.
Gotcha. Somebody's asking, can you recommend where an emergency action plan template might be available?
There are a couple of them online. I don't have a specific one that I like, but I can tell you that if you go onto the internet and type in, emergency action plan templates, a number of them will come up. Some of them are free. Some of them you'll pay some money for the download. And then the e-tool from FedOSHA is actually very good. I've used it myself several times.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question, is it recommended to schedule a training with our local fire department, or can we prepare and train with this webinar information?
Okay, training with this webinar information. The only problem with training with this webinar information would be that you have to adapt it to your workplace, okay? There's a lot of information here, and there's a lot of information that would apply to your workplace, I'm sure, but it may not cover everything. So I would always recommend, anytime you go out and get something that's sort of a template or something that's generic, you need to make sure that you take that generic program and incorporate those specific elements that apply at your workplace. That's number one. And then number two, the idea that, my train of thought just derailed. Michelle, what was the first part of that question?
They just said, is it recommended to schedule a training with their local fire department?
Yeah, scheduling a training with the fire department. Depending upon the nature of the exposure that you have at your workplace, I would highly recommend contacting the fire department and having the fire department participate. Now, of course, I had an extreme situation at the farms. I mean, in one facility alone, I had 150,000 pounds of anhydrous ammonia. Every year, we scheduled a training with the fire department and with the hazardous materials response team for the county fire department at our facility, and we would do a mock drill. I mean, it would be an all-day thing, because if we ever had a leak that released, 100,000 pounds of anhydrous ammonia, it would be the kind of emergency that would involve, 4 or 5 different fire departments. I can't imagine the number of people that would have been called out to respond to that. And so we looked at it and said, you know what, this is something we need to make sure that we have outside input on. And so we would bring the fire department in every year. And sometimes we'd bring them in more than once, because they would rotate out a crew and the new fire crew didn't know anything about us. So, take a look at what you got, and there's going to be a break point in that which says, yeah, we need to get the locals involved. And, they actually like it, because it gives them an opportunity to look at a business like yours, and then the next time they see a business like yours that they're called out into, they have a better chance and a better opportunity to respond to it. So I would recommend it, depending on what your exposure is. If you got significant amounts of highly hazardous chemicals or something like that, then yes, definitely get the fire department involved.
Great. Well, again, thank you everybody for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, Joel, for your time and expertise today. We hope all the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. Be sure to join us on February 17th for everything you need to know about your employee handbook webinar. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.